Every house has one point where the outside world and the inside world meet. And for centuries, the people of Britain and Ireland treated that single point as the most dangerous spot in the entire building. Not the cellar, not the attic, not even the graveyard down the road, but the door itself, and more precisely, the threshold beneath it. A door was never just wood and a hinge. It was a boundary, a seam between two realities, and folklore across the British Isles is filled with rules about what could and could not cross that seam, when it was safe to open a door, and when opening it at all could invite something in that no household wanted. This idea sounds strange to modern ears, yet it shaped daily behavior for generations. People buried objects beneath their doorsteps. They carried the dead out feet first so a restless spirit could never see its way back inside. They refused to sweep dust across a threshold after sunset, fearing they would sweep away the household's luck along with it. They nailed iron above their doors, not for defense against burglars, but against something far less physical. And on certain nights of the year, doors that were normally locked tight were deliberately left open, because closing them was considered more dangerous than leaving them unguarded. To understand why an ordinary doorway carried this much weight, we need to look at what people across England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland actually believed lived on the other side of it, and why crossing that line, in either direction, at the wrong moment, was thought to change everything. The pattern that emerges is remarkably consistent from region to region, even where the specific creatures and rituals differ. A threshold was never neutral ground. It belonged to both worlds at once, and anything caught standing directly on it, human or otherwise, was considered exposed, unprotected, and briefly outside the normal rules that kept the living and the dead, the human and the otherworldly, safely apart. In England, the doorway was treated as a kind of quiet battlefield long before anyone wrote down the reasons why. One of the most widespread customs was the fixing of a horseshoe above the entrance, and while today people assume this was simply for luck, the older belief was far more specific. Iron itself was thought to repel witches and other otherworldly beings, and a horseshoe placed with its points facing upward was said to catch and hold that protective power directly over the one gap in the house that anything could slip through. Some households went further and buried small glass bottles filled with pins, nails, hair, and urine directly beneath the doorstep or the hearth, a practice historians now refer to as a witch bottle, intended to trap and injure any hostile magic aimed at the home before it ever crossed inside. Archaeologists have actually recovered a number of these bottles sealed beneath old cottage floors, which tells us this was not an idle superstition confined to a handful of eccentric villagers, but a genuinely widespread domestic practice. Funerals carried their own strict threshold rules. A coffin was almost always carried out of the house feet first rather than head first, based on the belief that if the deceased were carried out head first, they would be able to look back into the house they had just left, and that a lingering glance from the dead could draw their spirit back inside rather than letting it move on. In some regions, mourners avoided using the household's usual front door altogether for a funeral, instead removing the body through a back entrance, a window, or even a temporary gap knocked into a wall, specifically so the spirit of the departed would never learn the route back through the door it had used every day in life. New Year customs added another layer of threshold belief. The practice known as first footing held that the very first person to cross a home's threshold after midnight determined the luck of the entire household for the coming year. And in many parts of England, that first visitor was expected to be a dark-haired man carrying a small piece of coal, bread, or salt, since a fair-haired visitor, a woman, or someone arriving empty-handed, was thought to bring misfortune through the door with them. Even ordinary daily habits carried threshold anxiety. Sweeping dust or rubbish directly out through the front door was considered a way of sweeping the household's good fortune out along with it, so many families insisted that anything swept from the floor be gathered and removed through a back exit instead, never straight across the main entrance. Taken together, these customs reveal a household that saw its own front door not as a simple convenience, but as a checkpoint requiring constant, quiet vigilance. Crossing into Wales and Ireland, the idea of the dangerous threshold expands from individual houses to entire landscapes, and the stakes rise considerably. In Wales, certain nights of the year, particularly the eve of November, were believed to weaken the barrier between the human world and the otherworld so thoroughly that spirits, and occasionally the fair family themselves, could pass freely between the two. On these nights, households often left a door slightly open or a window unlatched, not out of carelessness, but because closing every entrance completely was thought to trap wandering spirits inside the house with no way back out, a fate considered far worse than a brief, harmless visit. Fires were kept burning through the night for the same reason, since an extinguished hearth on such an evening was believed to leave the household without any warmth to offer a passing spirit, inviting resentment rather than protection. Ireland carries this same principle into its landscape on a much larger scale. Certain hills, ring forts, and lone thorn trees across the Irish countryside were treated as literal doorways into the otherworld, understood not as decorative folklore, but as genuine physical thresholds that should never be built over, plowed through, or otherwise disturbed. Builders who ignored these boundaries reportedly experienced years of misfortune, equipment failure, or unexplained accidents, and there are documented cases well into the 20th century of road projects being quietly redirected around a single hawthorn tree rather than risk cutting through what locals still considered a fairy path. The concept of a corpse road appears strongly in Irish tradition as well, referring to specific, fixed routes that funeral processions were expected to follow between a home and a burial ground, since deviating from the traditional path was thought to confuse the spirit of the deceased, or, worse, to accidentally open a route between the world of the living and the dead that had no business being disturbed. Some communities also held that a body should never be carried across a threshold twice in the same direction, meaning that if mourners needed to bring a coffin back inside for any reason, they were required to use a different door entirely, rather than retrace their steps through the same opening. Even small domestic habits reflected this landscape-wide caution. Borrowing fire from a neighbor's hearth on certain nights was avoided, since carrying flame across someone else's threshold was thought to carry a portion of that household's luck away with it, leaving both homes vulnerable in different ways. Across Wales and Ireland alike, the boundary between inside and outside stopped being a simple architectural feature and became something closer to a living border that had to be managed, respected, and occasionally reinforced with fire, iron, or careful timing. Scotland pushes threshold belief into some of its most dramatic and best documented territory, largely because Scottish tradition ties the doorway directly to the movement of both the dead and the fair folk on specific, predictable nights of the year. During the same autumn festival observed across the Celtic world, Scottish households commonly left a door unbarred or a window cracked open through the night, based on the belief that the spirits of deceased family members might wish to visit their old homes, and that barring every entrance completely risked shutting out a loved one's spirit, while simultaneously trapping any less welcome visitor already inside. Food was frequently left out near the hearth, or just inside the door on these nights, a practice meant to satisfy any wandering spirit before it wandered further into the house uninvited. Iron played an even larger role in Scottish threshold protection than it did further south. Beyond horseshoes above doorways, some households drove iron nails directly into door frames or laid an iron poker across the threshold itself before nightfall, since iron was believed to be one of the few materials capable of stopping both fairies and certain restless dead from crossing over entirely. One particularly Scottish belief held that a bride should never be the first to step over the threshold of her new home unassisted, and instead had to be carried across it by her new husband, a custom rooted in the idea that a threshold crossed alone at a moment of major life transition left a person unusually exposed to otherworldly attention. Funerals in the Scottish Highlands followed threshold rules just as strict as those in Ireland, with coffins carried out feet first, and mourners taking deliberately indirect routes back from the burial ground, specifically to avoid leading any lingering spirit straight back to the family home along a route it might remember. Certain remote communities also held that a door should never be left standing fully open and completely unattended after dark, since an open, unwatched threshold was considered an invitation rather than mere fresh air, particularly during storms, when the boundary between worlds was thought to weaken further still, carried along on the wind itself. Even something as small as an unexpected knock after dark carried weight, since answering too quickly before confirming who stood outside was thought to risk inviting something other than a human visitor across the threshold before its true nature could be identified. Taken as a whole, Scottish tradition treats the doorway less like a fixed barrier and more like a negotiation that had to be renewed constantly, honored on specific nights, reinforced with iron and fire, and never taken for granted simply because it had held firm the night before. Looking across England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland together, a single, remarkably consistent idea emerges from underneath all these regional variations, and it has very little to do with fear for its own sake. Every one of these customs, the horseshoe nailed above a door, the coffin carried out feet first, the fire kept burning through a long autumn night, the road quietly redirected around a single old tree, reflects a deep and practical respect for the idea that some boundaries deserve more caution than convenience allows. These were not people who believed the world beyond their doorstep was uniformly evil. Many of the same households that guarded their thresholds so carefully also left food out for wandering spirits and cracked their windows open for visiting ancestors, because the goal was never simply to keep everything out, but to control exactly what was allowed to cross over and when. That distinction matters because it reframes the entire tradition. This was not blind superstition scattered randomly across the countryside, but a shared, practical language for managing genuine uncertainty, applied consistently to funerals, to marriages, to the turning of the year, and to the ordinary act of sweeping a floor. Even today, echoes of these beliefs survive in small, almost unnoticed habits. The reluctance some people still feel about walking backward out of a room, the old superstition against crossing on a staircase, or the lingering unease certain rural communities feel about disturbing a lone, ancient tree standing exactly where a new road was meant to go. The doorway, in the end, was never really about wood, hinges, or iron. It was about the idea that certain lines, once crossed carelessly, cannot always be uncrossed again, and that a little caution at the threshold cost far less than discovering that lesson too late. So the next time you walk through your own front door without a second thought, consider that for centuries across these same islands, that single ordinary motion was treated as one of the most significant moments of a person's entire day. Did your own family ever pass down a threshold superstition? A rule about doors, coffins, or first footing after midnight? Tell me in the comments which tradition you recognize from your own background. And if you want more deep dives into the forgotten rules that shaped everyday life across British and Irish folklore, subscribe for the next episode.